Hey everybody, I'm here with Rohini Ross, who needs no introduction whatsoever. Hi, my love. Hey,
Hello.
darling. So
Thank you so much
glad.
for having me.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you here. So glad. Well, I met Rohini years and years ago on a Pransky retreat, and Rohini was leading our little mini group of students with such luminosity and so much kindness. And it was really one of my first introductions to the three principles, and you were just living, like really living the love of it. And we were so safe in that little group. You made it so special for us. And so thank you for that. Like that was really a pivotal moment in my life. And yeah, so our podcast is Wonderful Words, and the words I've chosen from Rohini are ones that appeared in a blog because there's you write so beautifully. I should say you were a geographer and a international model, and a certified therapist, relationship therapist, and coach, and doing so much great work with Angus, your husband, and so these things that these words that you put out every week in your videos, there's so much in them. And what I really love particularly is how they're like real world things. You know, you're so honest in talking about life and marriage and children and work and everything. And so these words I think were so perfect for how you are in the world. So I'll read them out and then I'll let you talk.
Okay.
Okay, so here we are. Life events can be tragic and challenging, but who we are is never broken. We have the resource of our true nature that does not exist in the world of form. It cannot be comprehended by the intellect, but the deeper knowing of the resilience and well-being it provides can be felt.
Hmm.
Yeah, so lovely, my darling. So would you tell us about them, where they came from, and what you've seen?
Yeah. So when you shared that quote with me, it was one of those moments of reflection to check in with the feeling behind it and where that comes from. And I can't really say where that comes from. And I know that when I'm writing my best, it's something that is coming through me rather than something that I'm figuring out. But it made me think about what resonates with me in this moment about that quote. And I think it's so helpful for people to recognize that who we are is that deeper felt sense, that deeper resource that we have within us, and that we very much have a very real and alive human experience that has a human psychology that goes up and down and all over the place. But that knowing that we have within us is our guide, it is our support, it is our greatest resource. And it made me think about two examples, one where I really wasn't consciously aware of that resource, and one where I really was. And the first example, and I'm not telling them in the right time order. This first one I think came after the first one I'm sharing comes after the other one. But when I was giving birth to our second daughter, Angus was adamant that we not have a home birth for either of our children. I was really wanting to have a home birth, and he just couldn't do it. And I said, okay. So we ended up having hospital births for both of them. And for our second child, it was a very fast labor. I think it was about 45 minutes. We
Gosh,
barely got to the hospital time. It was like, oh, okay.
almost a
And everything went
motivator.
so, yeah. So everything went so smoothly. But this is my second child, and I kind of knew how I felt after my first one, and I knew that I wasn't feeling okay. And I told the nurse, and they brought the doctor in, and I think they thought I was just being really histrionic, that I was because I was saying I'm in pain, I don't feel good, and they didn't treat me very nicely. So anyway, this goes on for a few hours, And they can start to see that my vital signs are showing that something's wrong, but they don't know what's going on. And at one point, like I can literally feel the life seeping out of me. And what was going on is I was hemorrhaging internally, and they just didn't know that because it hadn't come out. It was ballooning inside of me. And so I could feel myself slipping away. And I said to Angus, I said, I don't want to die. And in his best attempt to be supportive and loving, he goes, you're not going to die. He's telling me that. And I really wasn't that close to death, because I said, don't tell me I'm not going to die. But I was not, I was in the fear of that moment. I was in my psychology. I wasn't really connected to a deeper sense of peace and well-being. I was scared. And then very shortly after that, whatever was building up, it burst, and they could see that I was hemorrhaging, and I was rushed into the operating room and put under. So, but it was one of those experiences where, boy, I would have loved to have been connected with that deeper resource within me in that moment. And I think about how resistant I was to death. And I think that given that I'd just given birth, I think I can understand that I didn't want to leave at that point in time. But on a deeper existential level, I was really afraid of dying in that moment. There was the wanting to be present for all of life. And there was also this fear, because I could feel it approaching, of just being scared of that. And so when I thought about that quote and I thought about this experience, I realized, like, it's so close, that who we are, it's always there. It's so close. It is us. And yet it can feel so far away. And in that moment, when I would have hoped to have had much more of a spiritual experience, I had a very human, vulnerable moment. And that was it. And that, for me, is a helpful reminder to stay humble and to stay real. And I think that with a spiritual understanding, it's very easy for people to set these expectations for themselves. I'll speak for myself, that I can set these expectations for myself, that in that kind of moment that I would be zen and peaceful, and I just wasn't. And then there's the second example that came to mind, where I was probably, I don't know, I think it was probably my 20s or maybe early 30s. No, probably my 20s. And so Angus and I had moved to the US pretty recently, and we were going through all of the immigration things that you need to go through to live here and work here legally. And I am a Canadian citizen, and so I had done all of that process through my Canadian citizenship and my Canadian passport. So at the time I was modeling, and when you're modeling, you're kind of having to just go at the drop of a hat. And I hadn't been very responsible, and I had let my Canadian passport lapse. I hadn't realized that it had expired. And so I had an important job to fly to in Europe. And so I used my British passport, because I also have my British citizenship. So I used my British passport, go and do the job. Angus met me in London. We spent some time there, and then we came back to the US together. And so when we come back to the US together, show my passport, he shows his passport, he always sails through customs, by the way. I always get checked. But anyway, he sails through, gets onto the other side, and the woman starts interrogating me in a very kind of rude way. And I was like, what do you mean? Here's my whatever visa that I had it in my hand. Here's my passport. What I didn't know was that if you're a Canadian citizen, you can have your visa in your hand and you can have your passport. But if you're a British citizen, it needs to be stamped in your passport. And I didn't know that. But I had it. I showed it to the woman. But anyway, so she was like, it was almost like a SWAT team came down upon me, takes me into another room, says I can't enter the country, basically has me make a choice between willingly being deported or going to court. And I'm like, I didn't even know what to do. You're not in a country, so you have no rights.
Yeah.
So I just said that I would be willingly deported, and they take you to a jail. They take you to stay in a jail, which is, it's not like a penitentiary, but it's a building where all of these people are being held, either waiting for a court date or being deported. There was another young woman with me who was from Italy, and she was going to be deported as well. And looking back and knowing the outcome, I can see that it wasn't as big a deal as it felt, but I had never been arrested. I hadn't even had a speeding ticket at that point in my life. And at first it wasn't quite occurring to me what was happening, because I asked them if they had bottled water. And I realized at some point, I'm in jail. You don't get to ask for bottled water when you're in jail. And so now they have guards. Like, I'm in the building, there's guards, there's guns. Like, I'm getting the picture at this point. And I'm not allowed to call Angus. They won't let you call anyone. And I because I'd watched enough Law and Order or some TV show that, well, maybe they'll let me call my attorney. So I said, I want to call my attorney. And so they did let me call my attorney. And fortunately, I was able to get through to him. He was in New York, and I was just in floods of tears. And I said, they won't let me call Angus. I'm being deported. I don't know if they're going to let me back into the country. Please, can you help me? And can you tell, the most important thing I said to him is, can you tell Angus that I'm okay? Because I just knew that Angus was going to be beside himself. And that really touched his heartstrings. And that's sort of a whole other part of the story. But what happened that night, I was just in floods of tears. I didn't know when I was going to see Angus again. I didn't know if my whole career trajectory was going to have to be changed because I wasn't going to be allowed to be back in the US. It felt like my life was falling apart. So that was my experience. Big picture, it wasn't, but that's how I felt. And in the midst of that experience, there was at some point, probably around 2:00 in the morning, where it just occurred to me to pray. And that wasn't something that I did on a regular basis. I was involved in yoga and meditation, and I did a lot of meditation, but I'd never really done a lot of prayer. And I just opened up my heart. And I don't even know what I prayed for. I can't remember. But I remember the experience of the incredible peace just descending on me, infusing me. And I felt absolutely okay. And I went straight to sleep. And it was such a profound experience that it struck me, to this day. I can like I'm talking about, I can kind of feel the chills in my body, that was me having that experiential knowing of who I am. And that I didn't know that's what I was looking for. My wisdom just pointed me in a certain direction, and I followed it in that moment. And I felt so desperate that I was going to do anything. Fortunately, prayer was what occurred to me. But and that's what the experience was. And so in that moment, that resource was available. And it wasn't until years later that I really understood what happened to me in that moment, that with this understanding, my mind just got really quiet, and I was able to feel what was true. I was able to feel what was real. I wasn't caught up in identifying with all of the thinking that was going into negative future fantasy about what was going to happen, and things that were, it felt like I was never going to see Angus again. Like, on what planet would that happen? If I couldn't come back to the US, I'm sure he would have come back to England. We were married at the time. So but that was how it felt in the moment. And so when I think about that quote, it's about recognizing that even though we don't always have that experience, even though it doesn't feel like we are always that is who we are. And we have these gifts and these beautiful moments where we really get to experience it deeply. But it's not on our personal demand. But when we understand what allows us to have a deeper experience of it, it seems like we have more moments of grace around it. So it's not like in this moment I can go, okay, peak experience, I want one now. Like, that's not how it works. But I do know that if I'm ever in that kind of distress again, even though I didn't think of it at the time with my second, daughter, my mind was too stirred up. That wasn't occurring to me. I'm caught up in my thinking. That's why I'm afraid of death. Like, that wasn't where I was. But there's a part of me that does know that reference point now. And I think also to say that with um, the birth of our second daughter, I really didn't have much of an understanding at that point. I don't think I really had any understanding of the um, more clarity about how human psychology works. And I think that's what I'm so grateful for these days, is to just have a better sense of what gets in the way of me experiencing that peace, and to know that it's okay and I don't need to fix it. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with me, and that it, most importantly, doesn't mean anything about me, that I don't live in that feeling all of the time, which is what I used to think it did.
Mm, mm. Oh, Rohini, that's so beautiful. And actually, there's a question that's come into the podcast about prayer. Ironically, it was the first time it's ever been asked about. And so, so maybe would you say a little bit more about what is it that either in that moment of prayer or in times of under, deeper understanding, what do you see as allowing that greater access or uncovering of what's really happening?
It was surrender.
Ah, yeah,
It
yeah.
was just surrendering to what is. I stopped resisting.
Mm,
And so in that moment of stopping the resistance and just accepting, I'm in jail, I'm
yeah,
being deported tomorrow, this is what's happening, and to stop that internal battle. And I just surrendered, and in that space of surrender, I was able to feel more of what's true.
yeah,
And I think we get better at surrendering when we understand what gets in the way of us experiencing it. Doesn't, and there's no perfection in that, but I think I do get better at surrendering these days, even in the mundane and the ordinary. It's amazing how much our conditioning and our habitual thoughts create tension, create urgency, create anxiety on a subtle level that just feels like, oh well, this is life, this is normal. And then all of a sudden there's an awareness that comes in. It's like, oh, I can just let go, there's
mm,
nothing to fight here, it's okay.
so,
And even when things aren't, in my mind, okay on the outside, resistance within myself to it never helps. Like, it's not that it provides a solution.
mm, mm. And do you see it as a form of grace that allows that surrender in that moment? Is
Yeah, I think so, because it's like, if I could do it with my personal will, I would be living in that
yeah,
feeling all of the time. And
yeah,
it just doesn't work that way. So there are those moments of grace. And I think that it's, someone said some kind of story about a Zen teacher talking about meditation and the importance of meditation. And yet we still don't know when we're going to have that moment of enlightenment. And he said, but it just makes you a whole lot luckier. And
mm,
so I think that having an understanding of what gets in the way of having that experience, recognizing the role that being identified with our thinking has in creating our reality, our lived experience of reality, seeing that, I think, helps to be less identified with it, so that it's more easy for those moments of grace
yeah,
to insert themselves into our lives.
yeah. Oh, so beautiful. And how does this how is this brought into your work? You know, I'm really curious about the rewilding and
Mm.
how is that
Yeah.
part of it?
Well, we use the metaphor of rewilding. Rewilding is a term that's often used related to nature, how nature can be rewilded back to its natural state, that there's an intelligence within nature, that when you allow it to have the resources that it needs, it can rewild itself back to a really healthy, vibrant ecosystem. And Angus and I love using that metaphor for how we as humans can be rewilded back to our natural state. And we see that natural state as our natural loving state, that peaceful state, that state of well-being. And that we can let go of conditioning and all of the taming of our thinking and feel that aliveness and that wildness inside of us and have that as a reference point and a compass point. And that doesn't mean that we're going to let go of all of our conditioning. But when we understand the difference between the two, it's really helpful to see what our true north is and to allow ourselves to be open and willing to experience more of who we are. And I think that it can be very threatening to our comfort, to our ego's sense of familiarity, to
Mm.
come back to that natural state. Even though it's so beautiful and so loving, it can be scary to sort of rip away some of that conditioning. And so for me, the term rewilding captures the wildness of that experience. It's not just sitting on a mountaintop in a Zen position. It can be wild. And I think it also, for me, really captures the wholeness of the human experience, and that all of it is for us. Like, rewilding is an ongoing, alive process that isn't always going to look pretty and peaceful, and that it is still that journey of coming back to our true nature. And I just felt like people can be very hard on themselves, myself included, about having to be in a certain state of mind all of the time, having to be a certain way, having a spiritual journey needing to be one thing. It means this, it doesn't mean that. And it's like, well, actually, all of this is in service to our awakening. None of it is not in service to that.
Oh, so beautiful. And how do you um show people their true nature? How do you work with someone or a couple, say, when you
Yeah. So the couples work that Angus and I do, we put a lot of emphasis on the set and setting. They use that words a lot in the psychedelic movement, but we think it's very important as well. So we ask them to take time out of their lives and to be in a retreat-like setting. A lot of people come to where we are in Topanga and stay in an Airbnb and just sort of step out of their regular lives so that they can have the 4-day period where they can really settle. And so we know how valuable that is, to let the mind relax, to let the body relax, to listen to what you need, what the body needs. And most people are tired. Most people have really busy minds, and it takes a little bit for their mind to settle. And so it's not so much that we're doing anything to them, but we're setting them up to come back to their natural state through having a more peaceful, tranquil environment where they can get settled. And then when we sort of have that experience with them, we find it's pretty easy. I mean, not always, but pretty easy. Most people want to feel better. Most people want to feel more peace of mind. Most people are committed to having a different experience in their relationship if they're working with us. Although we are doing more work with couples that are wanting to separate and supporting them, doing that in a loving way too.
Mhm.
So, but we are not attached to any kind of outcome on the relationship level. We're really clear that that is not our responsibility, and we're not to know what's for the highest good of people. But where our emphasis is to support each one of them. So a lot of the work is done one-on-one, not all of it is done together, with connecting more deeply within themselves, with that knowing that they're fundamentally okay, with that experience of their heart opening first and foremost to themselves, but realizing that living from that open-hearted space, life looks really different. And that the only thing that gets in the way of that is misunderstandings that we have, misunderstandings about what we need to do in order to be safe, misunderstandings about our innate value and worth. And
Mhm.
so as those misunderstandings start to clear up simply through conversation, we're just having conversations, and they start to see more clearly, their own wisdom is what they hear. They're not hearing our wisdom, they're hearing their own wisdom. They're hearing their own knowing of what's true, what's alive inside of them. And then from that more open-hearted space, they can have different conversations, they can see different possibilities, they can find their own solutions to what seem like deal breaker monumental issues then become, oh, okay, well, what if we did it this way? And it's amazing just the shift that can happen in a fairly short amount of time. And then we recognize that people don't live in a retreat like setting, and so we have integration sessions that we walk with them as they go back into their life for a few months to support whatever they saw being sustainable during that time, and also hopefully helping them see that just because they're going back into their regular lives, it doesn't mean that they have to be in the same state of mind that they were in previously, that they can have a greater respect for a quiet mind, a greater respect for their own human, physical, emotional, mental needs, and not push through them, and
Mm.
instead take care of themselves in ways that they might not have even realized they weren't taking care of themselves. And I think that also comes back to the rewilding, where it's like we have emotions, we have a physical body that gives us incredible feedback, but our intellect tends to override the feedback. And so we learn to push through, we learn to not use the beautiful, finely tuned mechanisms that we have to let us know how we're doing, how to take care of ourselves. And so we talk about having a greater sensitivity. There's a lot of talk about mental toughness. We actually talk about having a greater sensitivity so that people can be responsive to the feedback that is guiding them, that is their wisdom speaking to them all of the time. So
Mm.
hopefully that gives you a little taste of it.
Oh, it does. So beautiful. So beautiful. And to hear you describe it and talk about it, it's just wonderful. Yeah, and so you in your book, you wrote a book called Marriage,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm really fascinated, and because what I really love is I mentioned when at the start of that. I think what's so powerful is that combination of the underlying truth, the foundational truth of what we are, that is then showing up in the human form and in behaviors and words. And do you see that, or how do you understand attraction, I guess, and longevity of relationship and
Hmm.
conditioning, and what
Yeah.
what what drives it?
Well, I do think that attraction in relationship is often like when people have that chemistry, there's often a deeper knowing about what's going to serve growth and consciousness. I see that in my own relationship, I see that in other people. And what starts off as being very attractive and appealing about that attraction, often after a period of time becomes really annoying and frustrating. And to me, that's when the learning curve really kicks in.
Mm, mm,
And at the beginning of a relationship, all of the newness and all of the sort of the physiological neurochemicals that are running through the system, it is kind of like a drug, probably is a drug. I don't know enough about that side of it, but it kind of clears the mind. And so we see very open-heartedly, I think. And then we get back into the busyness, we get back into our conditioning, and then we see things very differently. And all of a sudden, the person that had all of these cute traits before, now they're really annoying. And I can't believe, Angus, you leave the cupboard doors open all the time. Like, it's like, that's really cute. He's like that. That's really annoying that he's like that. Right. It's like same
yeah.
guy, different point of view inside of myself. And when we have that shift, if we don't really understand that we're up against our conditioning, that we weren't up against our conditioning, and we really were attracted to that person, and now we're up against our conditioning, we start to think, well, they need to change, which is what I thought. If
Mm,
only you would shut the cupboard doors, or whatever the things are on my list of annoyances. If only you would do this or that, then I would be happy. And that to me is a fundamental misunderstanding that is very easy for humans to fall into, is that our happiness is dependent on something outside of ourselves or someone outside of ourselves. And
mm,
that creates so much pain and suffering for us as individuals, but also it breaks down the goodwill and rapport in relationships. And I'm not saying that every couple should stay together. Like I said, I think that some couples, there's a point where it's like we're complete, and
mm,
all Angus and I really look for is making that decision from a place of open-heartedness and love, and
Yeah.
that we trust decisions made from that place. And so it's because I think, again, people can get very dogmatic about, well, if you have this kind of understanding, then that means you should stay in any relationship. And I just don't think that's true. And we just have to listen to what our wisdom guides us toward. But that that attraction, I think, is probably, and I've even heard people say, if you feel really attracted to someone, run, don't go there. And I think it is because there's that awareness that you're going to have a learning curve at some point. But for me, that learning curve, I'm so grateful for the challenges that Angus and I've had in our relationship. And because they have allowed me to see my conditioning in a way that it was invisible to me.
Yeah.
And that without that mirror, without that reflection, I don't know that I would have been humbled in the way that I would have been humbled. I don't know that I would have let go of my arrogance in the way that I was forced to let go of my arrogance. I think it would have been much easier for me to live thinking, well, I'm just right and he's wrong. Or, just, I don't know. It was a really helpful way for me to let go of conditioning and to really see beyond what I thought was right and what I thought was true to something that was much deeper and more loving and more kind. And but not everybody has that trajectory, right? And sometimes when we connect with that deeper place inside of ourselves, it becomes clear that it's time to move on. And it's really funny because there's like a theme of couples that Angus and I are working with currently, where that is the theme, where they have decided to move on and they're wanting to do it in a more loving way, and they're needing support in that. And it's absolutely part of their learning curve as well. So it really doesn't matter. In a sense, everything can be used for growth and consciousness. Everything is part of our awakening. And we don't need to know that sort of journey. It shows up for us, right? We show up and life teaches us along the way.
Oh, Rohini, it's so great. It's such a beautiful mix of it, like so practical and so spiritual, isn't it? So I just love it. I love it. Oh, darlings. So is just before we end, because coming to the end of our time, is there anything that you would say, maybe thinking back to the quote that we began with,
Hmm.
to anyone who's listening to this, who perhaps is sort of deeply struggling or finding it hard to really come in touch with any of the words that we've spoken about today,
Yeah.
what would you say?
If at all possible, can you surrender to your experience and open to your experience, open to the feelings, rather than contract and resist? Can you allow the feelings to move through you without trying to change how you feel, without having any specific agenda, but just simply be open to your experience and know that in that openness, more will be given to you. More wisdom, more love, more knowing of who you are. And I think it is the simplicity of staying open. But even though it's simple, most of our conditioning has us want to not be open at all when we're suffering. And so it can feel very counterintuitive to really allow feelings to move through us. And so I would say, if it feels really scary, to reach out for support. You don't have to do it alone. And I think that's one of the things that I see over and over again, is that when we come together, when we love each other, when we support each other, there's so much given to us as the giver as well as the receiver. And so to allow yourself to receive, allow yourself to be supported, don't feel like you need to do it alone. And know that with that kind of love and support, you can stay open and you can receive everything that's available to you.
Mm. Oh, Rohini, that's so wonderful. Thank you, darling.
Oh, thank you so much, Claire.
Truly wonderful words, and from someone who lives it in every way. I'm so grateful. Thank you, darling. Thank you. See you soon. Bye,
Thank you
lovely.
so much.
Bye.